Destiny players are speculating pretty hard about what comes next. Invested players want to know what's going to keep them playing after the current roadmap, and there are lapsed players who wonder if they'll have a reason to return to the game. And if we couple this with our past experiences with Destiny content, but also some of the reputable leaks that suggest Year 3 will have another annual pass, it does lead to more speculation, and even concern for some players that this perhaps isn't the perfect model for Destiny content. So let's talk about what's missing in the annual pass, but also September or Year 3, and why that really needs a bigger expansion, and how Bungie could possibly improve elements of the next annual pass, or Year 3 content in whatever form it takes. As always with these discussions though, hopefully this will be a catalyst for you guys, and as always, your thoughts are vitally important to the game, so don't hold back in the comment section. But let's jump in and talk about some of this. So, the annual pass was designed to provide Destiny players with content kind of throughout the year, and essentially it has done that. We have the seasonal model, and every 3 months we get a smaller DLC that rolls out to set a new kind of theme for the season, and then the game of course is supported by live events and a seasonal roadmap of content. So on the whole, we certainly end up with more stuff to do week over week in Destiny right now than what we've had in the past. But of course, this type of content does have its limits, and what we find in Joker's Wild or Black Armory is a new kind of mini endgame which gets tacked on to the rest of the world. With Black Armory it was forges with new gear, triumphs, and progression like the titles, but so the content drops can be kind of niche or focused, and Joker's Wild, Gambit Prime, is a very good example of that happening. At the same time, Bungie do their best to create stuff which will interest different types of players. Some of the Forge weapons, for example, are really appealing to purely PvP-focused players, as well as PvE players, or folks who are very specifically clearing out that content and maybe going for a title like Blacksmith. And there is kind of a similar situation with Season 6 DLC, although I think Joker's Wild generally has been a bit less appealing than Black Armory. But nonetheless, this is the endgame element that is kind of present with the annual pass. So why are players seemingly less engaged by the current content model, and what is it that's actually missing? Well, some of the bigger things that we do miss out on in this kind of content drop would be bigger innovations in the systems in the game. Things like Masterworks or Catalysts, for example. But we also don't get new real estate on the most part, so no new patrol zones or strikes, no new major story content, although Bungie have been doing some pretty interesting things like invitations. But we also miss out on more new PvP maps or modes, and the list really could go on. But the difference between Year 1 content and Year 2 content after Forsaken is that with Curse of Osiris, while it wasn't absolutely brilliant, did kind of have that endgame element that you'd see in an annual pass drop, so that would be something like Mercury's Forge weapons. And then you get the kind of minimal story chain, a new location, new strikes, we did have a raid lair, and we were getting seasonal PvP map updates and things like that, on top of small introductions like Masterworks, which happened within that season. And then if you fast forward to Warmind, things are definitely getting better. We got a bigger, more interesting patrol zone, and that featured escalation protocol. An EP is pretty similar to that annual pass element, and that had a loot table which has been pretty popular, but then on top, new strikes, PvP updates, and a couple of maps, as well as a bigger sandbox update that ran just before the DLC, and then the introduction of exotic catalysts, the return of collectibles, and generally the real growth of endgame in Destiny again. And of course, many of these things really needed to happen in Year 1 because the game was kind of on a lifeline, and I think it's fair to say that Bungie did respond. And then of course came Forsaken, which was huge and mostly fantastic for Destiny 2. But when you look at how Year 1 worked, we do kind of get a better idea of what players feel is missing in the current annual pass model for the game. Now, we've heard the rumor that Destiny 2 will have a Year 3 annual pass. And so, there are many players who are kind of worried about this concept, the idea that content will essentially carry on working like it does right now, and partly, I think there is a question of which model works better. So do you guys feel like a year with 2 drops similar to Warmind would be better than 3 smaller drops like we have at the moment? I think that's an interesting question, but that's something we'll discuss more in just a second. For me, and I think a lot of other players though, it really does highlight why a more major expansion in September of this year will be pretty important in carrying the game into Year 3. So what does that major September expansion generally look like, and what could we expect this year? Well, of course, Forsaken is what we've come to call a Comet expansion, so much like Taken King in D1, this is where we get a huge amount of new content, system changes, and multiple extensions of the endgame across kind of different niches or types of content. But a good question is, can we expect Bungie to have another Forsaken in Destiny 2? Do you guys feel that that's going to be realistic? Now, personally, I kind of doubt it. with Bungie doubling down on the future of the franchise and focusing on the next game, while probably also making a lot of very big decisions about how they operate, it feels like something as big as Forsaken is likely to be more than a stretch, especially if it wasn't planned going into year 2. But would a Rise of Iron style expansion be more realistic? Well, of course, I think most of us will probably agree, because much like we saw in year 3 of D1, we had essentially the second biggest expansion to the game, and this definitely does look like a more realistic possibility. I think also though, while there is concern about September, one thing to bear in mind is that Bungie probably know they'll need a catalyst to launch and sell a year 3 annual pass, assuming that's a thing. I think they would definitely have a challenge doing that without something to kick it off, but also without having any revisions on how the content actually works, and so I think we could probably expect change and more exciting content for the game. Some additional things to consider would be the teases from Bungie about things like future PvP content, as Bungie have suggested that there are more substantial and meaningful Crucible content drops on the table for a future release. And that would very likely be in September or beyond, based on the current roadmap, and I think that's encouraging in most respects, but regardless, we really know at this point that we need at least one bigger, more exciting drop. But as well, I think additions to the game like exotic catalysts, other things like set bonuses for endgame gear, that's just an example, maybe a rework on power leveling systems, those much wider innovations are really needed to keep the game healthy and investable. And again, those are just examples. The list could go on and it's really shaped depending on what is most important to you as a player. But the reality is, inside of annual pass content drops, is that these kinds of changes or innovations are pretty irregular. Bungie aren't really focused on reinventing anything, the focus remains on having content first and foremost, but it is clear how this can be somewhat fatiguing to the player base, right? So I think a Rise of Iron style drop could be the near perfect, or should I say best option for Bungie, as well as the players. You know, I think we could really benefit from things like maybe a new social hub, although we don't need the Farm 2.0, I suppose. But you know, a new destination, even if it was kind of similar to the Plaguelands, I think Bungie should keep expanding on the way they're delivering story and lore as well. We do also need those PvP additions and new content in the endgame cycle, raw quality of life reworks and investment options, and even in a DLC or expansion that isn't as big as Forsaken, Bungie can offer up some pretty tasty stuff, you know, if you look at common requests like trials, or truly godly endgame cosmetics, vendor inventories, seasonal refreshes on that stuff. It feels like there are a lot of unexplored elements, or things that could be revised which Bungie have done in the past, that would kind of truly delight players, and again, these are reasons that I think we need that more substantial drop in September. So do you guys agree with this? I'd love to hear what you think as an invested player right now, but also, there are a lot of people who've kind of lapsed and aren't playing right now, and that does include owners of the annual pass, you know, so I'd love to hear what you guys think and what would bring you back to Destiny if that's you. But these have just been a few of my thoughts, combined with what I see an awful lot in the comment section, on Reddit and all that kind of stuff, so hopefully this is somewhat useful feedback. But the final question that really remains would be, is a year 1 or season pass style model potentially better for players? You know, if we had 2 DLCs similar to what we had in year 1, but of course with the updated systems and then new innovations, of course the benefits of those kind of drops could possibly be that they are more substantial. The downside is that we may get fewer drops of content, it could be more expensive to actually purchase the DLC, and of course it would be more of a drain on Bungie's resources. So again, I'd love to hear where you guys stand. Would you pay more money for more content or bigger DLCs? Do you think that we should already get more for our money? Or do you think that the content could somehow be designed better? It's also possible that you find the game more or less perfect as it is. And for me, I'd definitely love to get more content, but I think it's worth me saying that I don't personally feel like I'm not getting value from the annual pass because I play a lot of Destiny. So while I'd love to see more improvements, the content for me is pretty good value, but that does depend on the kind of player you are, how much you're playing Destiny right now, and whether the bulk of this content on the whole is really kind of interesting to you. I think it's definitely a pretty stimulating conversation, especially now that we've had 2 of those annual pass drops, right? We have a bit more of an idea of what this really looks like for the game. But the one thing I have no doubt about is that we do need something which feels bigger and more exciting, something a little closer to that Forsaken type drop, even if it's more akin to Rise of Iron in size. Plus, as we've discussed, there are a lot of options and things that Bungie could do which would really excite players regardless of the exact scale of a DLC drop. Whatever comes after next season though is most definitely the time to do it. So share your thoughts below, guys. This is absolutely a community discussion, so let's get at it in those comments down below. Be sure to let me know how you feel, and I'm going to avoid doing any more ranting. I think it's time to hear you guys. So thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed the conversation, a rating below would be very kind of you. If you want to see more Destiny content, news, guides, and all that good stuff, then feel free to hit subscribe. But otherwise, I hope that you guys have an awesome day.